green light.
Oh, okay, perfect. Okay, so round two here. My name is Ian Harmon. As Laura mentioned, and I work at the Scholarly Commons at the main library here at the University of Illinois, which is the Digital Scholarship Center for the library. So we have, I'll mention a couple of things we have there that just may be of interest. We have, for one, a lot of scanners. So if you ever have any digitization needs, it's a great place to go. We also have software for both quantitative and qualitative analysis. So we have statistics software, SPSS, Stata, SAS, as well as a couple more. And then we also have some GIS software and some qualitative analysis software, Atlas TI and InVivo are a couple that come to mind. So we also offer consultations on sort of computational research techniques. So just if any that's ever something you are interested in or need, feel free to contact me and I could put you in touch with the people there. My email address is iharmon2@illinois.edu. And then on the topic for today, I want to highlight this research guide, which is at guides.library.illinois.edu/poster, as a lot of the material I'll be covering today is covered in even more depth on this research guide, as well as a lot of material that I don't have time to cover here today. Now, this presentation is prepared sort of for all levels of audiences, and so some of the stuff I might be talking about at the beginning might be familiar, but I'll go through it in any case, and that is starting out with this question of, well, what is a poster session for anyone who's never attended one or presented at one before? And so the way I like to describe a poster session is as sort of being a venue in which lots of researchers have the opportunity to share their work sort of concurrently. So as you see on the left here is sort of a fairly representative image of what a poster session might look like, where you have rows of posters set up and attendees kind of meandering through the rows to take a look at the research. And then on the right, you sort of have a close-up of a more sort of one-on-one interaction that could take place because you're not just standing there passively having people sort of look at your poster. The idea as a researcher is to be engaging with your audience as people come around. And so that's one thing I'll sort of be emphasizing, this presentation element to the poster session as we go on here today. So what is a poster session? It's a venue in which researchers can have the opportunity to visually convey the important details of their work and some important things to remember, just kind of pro tips or whatever, if you will, before we get into some more specifics. One is to think about dressing appropriately, as different disciplines will sort of have different standards of dress, some being far more formal than others, business casual sort of being a safe fallback. Another recommendation, if you're a first-time presenter, is to arrive early, to do things like figure out where the nearest restroom is, figure out where you could get coffee or a drink of water, or other necessities that may come up. Or if you get caught in traffic, you won't be, stressing out about running late or that sort of thing. Another recommendation is to bring push pens. At times, this will be the presenter's responsibility, and even in cases in which it's not, it doesn't hurt to have brought them with you. Or if you need to lend them to somebody, you'll, get some karma for doing that. So bring some push pens in case you need them to sort of mount your poster on an easel that's provided there. And then a couple other supplies to consider bringing are a black marker and some whiteout. The thought being that if you notice a typo at the last minute on your poster, you have the option of thinking about making a sort of hand alteration. Now, you may decide that this is actually going to draw more attention to the error, in which case maybe you don't want to do that. But, having the option doesn't hurt anything, and you could sort of make that judgment call. One thing I also like to mention is just if you notice a typo at the last minute, it's probably not that big a deal. So don't let that sort of throw you off or stress you out. And then one of the most important tips that I'll emphasize throughout this is to practice your presentation ahead of time. The more you practice sort of what you're going to say, your spiel, if you will, for attendees that come around, the more comfortable you'll feel giving it. And when I'm talking about practicing here, I mean actually sort of speak out loud, don't mentally rehearse it. And if you've ever given a presentation before and practiced, I think you'll sort of know firsthand what the value in this actually rehearsing it aloud can be. make eye contact with and address everyone. So oftentimes you'll be talking to one attendee who comes up to you and have additional attendees come up sort of midway through your conversation. And it's always nice, I think, to just sort of acknowledge people that arrive in the midst of your conversation. I don't think you need to sort of start over there. You could sort of start again when the first person has left, but you want people to feel, welcome and appreciated for coming to learn about your work. And just a simple smile and nod, eye contact is an easy way of doing that. And then the last thing is not to leave early. Sometimes these sessions can get really slow towards the end of the day, and it might be tempting to sort of cut out early. But this is sort of a disservice to the organizers of the event, and also potentially missed opportunities for you, anyone that may come later in the day who won't be able to speak to you about your research if you're no longer there. Okay, so these are just sort of key points that I like to mention at the very beginning. Now, as for the rest of the presentation, there's sort of two parts. The first is in which I discuss sort of three main components of a poster session, which are your presentation, the poster itself, and then a handout. And then during the second portion of the remainder of my time here today, I'll be talking more about poster design and formatting and that sort of thing. And then at the end, we'll look at some examples and sort of apply some of the things I've talked about, in terms of analyzing or commenting on some real world examples, and also draw your attention to some additional resources that you could look at on your own. Okay. So the way to think about when you hear poster session, you think sort of about the poster being the main component, the highlight. I mean, it is in the name after all. But really, there's three main parts to it. They're you, or more appropriately, your presentation, your poster, and your handout. People don't always take handouts to poster sessions, but I think it could be a great thing to do. And I'll say a little bit about why here in a minute. But let's start with you. So when we're talking about you, as I said, we're really sort of talking about this presentation that you should prepare. So often when we think about an academic presentation, we're thinking about a 20-minute to hour-long talk, that maybe is sort of a roundup of a paper that's in works or something like that. But in the context of a poster session, you don't have nearly as much time because there are so many people presenting, and attendees want to have a chance to look at as many different posters as they can. And so what we advise is to prepare a 1 to 2 minute, what we call lightning talk. That is a very quick sort of narrative of your research that highlights the most important things that you touched on throughout your work. The idea behind this lightning talk should be to complement rather than replicating the material on your poster. So you don't want to, just be reading through your poster for your lightning talk, but you want to sort of be providing additional context for the information that's on your poster, and sort of thinking about your poster almost as a sort of secondary to your presentation, a prop that you could rely on to, point to a visualization of your data or something like that. And so it's important to sort of think about how the information on your poster and how the information you'll be verbally presenting should work together. And there's no one size fits all answer for this. It will sort of depend on the nature of your work and your own presentation style. But I think it's important to think about these as sort of two distinct yet complementary modes of presenting your information. So, one example here that I sort of hinted at was you could think about a unique experience or insight that adds some depth to what the attendee could learn simply from looking at the poster itself. So even something like an anecdote about what got you started being interested in this topic, or what's some background or context that helps an attendee more fully appreciate the importance of the work that you're doing. Another thing that's important is to think about your audience. So I'll sort of talk about, on the one hand, you might sort of have a general audience in some context and a specialist audience in others. So you want to think about what the event you're attending, what it is and what kind of audience would be expected. And so when you're thinking about this, or the reason it's important to think about this is largely in terms of what kind of language or jargon you will or won't be using. If you're at a more generalist sort of event, then you can't make as many assumptions about what the audience will know. And a good idea in preparing for something like that might be to rehearse your presentation with a friend or family member or whatever who's not familiar with your area of research. And if they are sort of saying, well, I don't know what that meant, or I don't know what this means, then that's an indication to try to rephrase some of the information that you're trying to convey. Some other things to think about are what kinds of questions the audience might have for you. And so when you sort of go back to this issue of the lightning talk and then later the information on your poster, you got to think about, well, what's some information that I'm going to leave out because it's not among the most important things, but that someone with a little bit of curiosity might want more details there. So that's one way in which you might try to anticipate questions. You're obviously not going to be able to anticipate every sort of question, but this is another area in which practicing before an audience, even if it's just a friend or a family member, could be helpful, and you could encourage them to ask you questions afterwards, just to kind of have a little warm up for that. And then, as I mentioned again, thinking about this issue of whether you have a general or specialist audience. Okay, so that's the presentation itself. Now we'll move on sort of to the role of the poster. And as I said, in a bit, we'll look more at the sort of formatting and design issues as far as the poster go. So the way I advise to think about the poster is as an outline of your research that highlights the things you learned along the way. Outline is a key word here because one of the sort of biggest pitfalls that posters often make is trying to convey too much information, trying to convey an entire research project in a 36 by 48 piece of poster board or whatever. So you want to think about, well, what are the big things? You want to remember that you're going to be there to fill in more information as needed. And if you were to think about your work as a narrative, what would the chapters or the natural sections be? You want to think about also trying to have a balance of text and visuals. I'm sure some of you have seen sort of these wall of text type posters before, and they aren't always the most enticing, I guess, for audience members to come and look at. And so you want to, because part of it is, simple, attracting people's curiosity. So you do have to think a bit about trying to make something that's visually appealing to a certain extent. And so, well, it's important to have text, and it's very useful to have visuals. You want to, not lean too heavily on one or the other. And then, as I mentioned before, I'd encourage you to think about your poster as a prop for your presentation, not as the sort of the centerpiece. Again, it's there for you to refer to. It's there for audience members to kind of look at and, more closely after or before your presentation to get some more detail. But it's not there to do all the work. It's sort of your sidekick in a way, if you will. Okay. And then the last thing that I like to mention is a handout. I don't know how common these are, but I think they can be really useful for a number of reasons. The first being is that they sort of allow you to supplement the information on your poster. So I talked, just a moment ago about not putting too much information on your poster. So that information that didn't quite make it onto your poster could perhaps go onto a handout. Another thing that's useful about handouts is that they give attendees an easy way to remember you. So this could sort of be like a business card for your research, if you will. And so in light of that, you'll want to be sure to include your identifying information, your contact information, and perhaps even an image of the poster itself. So in terms of formatting, one recommendation would be to sort of have one sheet. I wouldn't use multiple pieces of paper, but have a two-sided sheet, and consider just using one side to put an image of the poster itself. The idea behind this is because maybe it will help people more, it'll kind of trigger their memory about, well, what's this information on this piece of paper I have about? Oh, yes, I remember that poster. Again, here I would say that perhaps a black and white image is okay as long as it's readable, because printing in color can be expensive. If you have the means to do it, then by all means do. But that's not always the case. So one option would be to have the image of the poster on one side and then sort of the additional details on the other. So some things you might think about would be citations, a literature review, information about some other research you have that's relevant to the topic at hand. And then some other suggestions would be if you have a website that highlights your research, to put the URL on that. If you have, you could place sort of a higher resolution image of your poster on the web somewhere and link to that. So any information that you want to convey, this is a great way to do it, and it allows people to take that with them and refer to it later, and then get in touch with you if they want to follow up or collaborate or whatever the case may be. Okay, so that's sort of these three components. So now we'll sort of be shifting gears to talking about actually designing posters themselves. So the first thing I want to mention is that the university provides some research poster templates in both InDesign and PowerPoint formats that you can use. And I'm going to try to go to these without messing up the webinar. So hopefully I can successfully do it. Is everything still? Okay, so are you seeing that screen now, or? Actually, no, now I'm seeing it. Okay, okay, so I'll just keep it there. Okay, so this is that website that I mentioned earlier. Yeah, I think it has to do with, well, okay, so that's I could open a second window here and just kind of that's an interesting idea, yeah. Replicate my, so now I'm, okay, I gotta put in poster here. Okay, so now I gotta remember where it is. I think I had a, I think I have a link for it on the back here actually. So let me do each of these windows in turn. So it is Public Affairs .illinois, whoops, EU / marketing / templates / research poster .html. Okay, and then let me just copy and paste that over here. Okay, so just to show, if we scroll down, these are what the templates look like. So you have an orange one and a blue one, as you might expect. But these are useful just if you, don't want to start from scratch. You're not, I'm not the most artistically inclined person personally, so I might consider using these just to give myself something to stand on. And so they have, sample sections put in there with things like conclusions, acknowledgments, and so on and so forth. But you could customize these as you see fit. They all, have the official university logo on there, which looks all nice and everything as well. So just want to bring your attention to those if you want something to start with, and then you could, go from there. Let me go back to the PowerPoint now. Okay, is the showing up, the PowerPoint showing up down there again? Okay, great. Oh, okay. Okay. Okay, so yeah, there's those templates. And so one thing to just draw your attention to is that these are by default 48 by 36 inches. It's good advice to check with your organizers ahead of time to make sure that's actually the appropriate size. So, when in doubt, contact the organizers of the event you're attending so that you don't show up with a much larger or smaller poster than everyone else. Although I don't think you'd be too far off in either direction. But just something to be aware of. Whoops. Okay, so whoops, now it's not. I don't have it in slideshow mode. Okay, what I'm seeing on the screen doesn't match but that's okay. Okay, so if you go into PowerPoint, for instance, you'll just go into your page setup area, and then you'll have the option to change the dimensions. So that's pretty simple to do. Okay, so there's sort of, that's sort of the little bit I'll say about formatting. Then the other question is, well, what do I actually put on my poster? And so there's kind of two categories that I break this down into. One, on the one hand, essentials, and then the other thing I call sort of optional or other options. So when I'm talking about, let me back up. The reason I break it down into these two categories is because what is appropriate for your poster depends on what you're doing. Having certain sections would make sense for certain people and it wouldn't make sense for others. Nevertheless, there are certain things that everyone should put on their poster regardless of their discipline or type of research. And so these are the essentials. The first being a title, ideally something a bit catchy and attention grabbing, and perhaps most importantly, large enough such that people could read it from a bit of a distance. So we recommend 72-point font sort of as a starting place, and then you could resize as necessary, just to kind of make everything look organized and pretty. One thing to think about here is length of titles. These could vary again from discipline to discipline. I think sometimes, at least in my experience in the sciences, you often have very long titles. And so consider whether it's possible to shorten those titles, in order to be able to kind of fit a legible title at the top of your poster. Obviously, you want your title to be representative and descriptive of your work. And this is another area where thinking about your audience could be useful as well. A very technical sounding title is probably fine for some places, but maybe a bit of a confusing or unclear in other contexts. So again, just think about your audience. You also want to include your name, your contact information, and then your University of Illinois or other institutional affiliation as appropriate. And then you want to include your research question or your hypothesis, kind of, well, what was the whole point of your research? And finally, you want to include your findings. What did you learn? What was the upshot of the work that you conducted? And sort of provide a summary or conclusion. One other thing that should probably go up here that I think is almost always essential anyway is a bit of background or sort of context setting information, especially if you're working on kind of a specialized topic that other people might not be familiar with. This could be useful because it allows you to have just a little bit of a chance to introduce the topic. So what exactly is the area in which you're working? What's kind of the background that you're building off of? Or providing some context. So if you're, there's this sort of issue going on, this issue leads to this question, and this question is what I'm addressing. So that sort of thing as well. You could call it an introduction, you could call it background, you could even call it an abstract, whatever seems most appropriate to you. Okay, so these are the essentials. Then we have what I call other options, and these are fairly sort of standard things you'll see in scientific presentations. So you might want to have information about your methodology. In some contexts, people could be very interested in learning more about your methods if you're using a new technique or a controversial technique, or just a method that people might not be familiar with or that wouldn't be obvious. It might be important to highlight this. And this is, again, where knowing your audience could be useful. You might include observations, depending, again, on the nature of your work, or data, visualized, presumably in some format. You might include images, although you want to be aware of copyright issues if you're using images that are not your own. The library has people who can help you identify images that are free to use that aren't your own. So if that's something that's of interest to you, then please don't hesitate to contact the library. The point here isn't to scare people away from using images, but if you do a search for frogs or something, and then just take an image of a frog off the web, somebody else might own the copyright to it, and we don't want you to get in trouble or get sued or anything like that. So just be aware that this is an issue. It's something that in the library world we like to emphasize a lot. But also, if you take your own images, you're certainly free to use those, unless you sold the copyright off to somebody. You might also include quotes from interviews if you've done interviews and have permission of your interviewees to sort of publicize their information. And then another thing that would be really useful is recommendations for future research, how others might build off your work, how you will continue to build off your work in the future, or kind of related to this, how what you found out fits into the sort of larger conversation going on in the area of your work. And then last, but certainly not least, acknowledgments. In particular, if you have funding of, from some sort of agency or institution, I believe often you're required to document this somewhere. Sometimes, you'll be supposed to put the logo of the agency or something. So be sure you do that if you're supposed to. And even if you're not like forced to, it's still a nice thing to do. Or if you have collaborators or colleagues who maybe weren't co-authors but contributed in some other sort of way, it's great to acknowledge them as well. Okay, a few other tips. One is to embrace the opportunity to be creative if that's something that you enjoy doing. It can be rare to have this sort of opportunity sometimes in the research world. And so if that appeals to you, this is a chance to do that. Put plenty of thought into your title. This is kind of the billboard for your work in a way. It's can be what determines whether somebody comes up to look at your poster more closely and to speak with you about your research or not. So, and this is again where thinking about your audience is really important. If someone sees a title and just says, I have no idea what that means, they're probably less inclined to come, learn about the topic. So, what would be intriguing but still descriptive of your work? Another sort of general tip in terms of the poster design is to, think about the sections that you'll be creating. So again, if you think about your research as a process, so the sort of information creation process, what were the different steps of that process? What were the kind of natural breaking points? And then you could think of that as sort of serving as a guide to the different sections that you might have. So title isn't really a part of your research process, but then abstract, methods, data, results, conclusion, the standard steps of the scientific method as one sort of example here. And then finally, being clear and to the point. As I've kind of hinted at before, I think the number one mistake that people make in poster sessions is trying to present too much information. So again, this is important for both your poster and your presentation. When you're practicing your presentation, if you find that this is getting too long, don't try to speak more quickly. Cut down on the information that you're conveying. That's the way I would recommend to address that issue. Similarly, for your poster, don't make your font smaller to fit more information on there. Consider using bullet points or something instead of paragraphs. So again, think about how an outsider, or not an outsider, but someone who's new to this work is going to approach it, and how that's going to visually strike them when they come up to it, because information overload is a very real thing. Okay, so at this point, I normally move into examples. Since we're in a webinar format, I'm not sure if there's a standard way you like to do questions, if people tend to ask them along the way, but I could stop now and see if there are any. Okay. 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 Okay, that's fine. So basically what I generally spend the last bit doing here then, I got through that a little bit quicker than I thought, but is go and look at some examples here, because I think intuitively a lot of us, probably most of us or all of us, have kind of an intuitive sense of, well, that's a good poster, that's a needs improvement poster. But I think it could help to look at some examples of posters and say, okay, I like that one, but what is it that I like about that one? What are the elements of that poster that make it effective? So that then you could identify those and think about how to incorporate them into your own work. Looking at the needs improvement category posters could be useful as well, because you have this reaction, well, I find this visually unappealing or overwhelming or whatever the case may be. So what are the design elements about that that sort of make that the case? So again, I might be faced with the dual windows here, but that's okay. So yeah, so maybe if I okay, maybe if I exit out of the yeah, we could just exit that and then oh, okay. Yeah, that would okay, this looks good. Okay. So this is, let me go just to start with here to this guide that I mentioned at the beginning. So when you go to, yeah, again, this is guides.library.illinois.edu/poster. This is what you see. So you have a lot of the information I went over. It's kind of here on the front page. And then you'll notice some different sections. I'm going to go through examples here in a minute, but beforehand, I just want to highlight a few other things. This is where you find the link to the research poster templates under the step-by-step section. There's also a direct link on the handout for those here in person. And then I believe there's some information here about choosing your content. And then if you're really interested in kind of design issues, we have this 10 Commandments of Typography here. And this has to do with information about people that are experts in this sort of thing have developed these guides to, well, what types of fonts look best together? What types of colors go well together? That sort of thing. So there's the opportunity to really dive into that. There's information about creating visualizations if you have data to visualize in some way. Lots of links there. And then also printing. So that's another thing. Technology Services does poster printing out of the English building. You all might have a sort of standard way you handle printing here, but that's a service that exists anyway, and I think has better rates than Kinko's or FedEx or the sort of other commercial vendors in town. I will mention also Ideals is our institutional repository that could serve as an archive for your posters later on. And then there's lots of more resources as well. Color palette generators to help you pick colors that go well together. Blogs on creating better posters. This guy, Colin Purrington, has tons of stuff on poster design. So I encourage you to take a look at that when you're making your posters and get a refresher. And if you're interested in some of this other stuff, looking at that as well. Okay. But now we'll look at some examples. So the one I like to go to here is this F1000 research. Is anyone familiar with that? It's a place that I'm not super familiar with it, but it's basically this kind of open science type of website where people could share things like posters and research slides and that sort of thing. So if you ever want to share your work, I'm not sure what the eligibility criteria are, but I think it's pretty open. So if you go to browse here, you could look at articles, reviews, and then slides as well, but we'll be looking at posters. And then I'll just kind of pick a few at random. And so what I'd basically say is I'd encourage you all to take a moment to look at them. Let me go to full screen. And might not be able to let me see if I could make it a little smaller to fit the whole thing at once here. And basically, you might find yourself forming this initial impression, thumbs up, thumbs down, thumbs in the middle. But ask yourself, why do you have that impression? What elements of the poster do you like, do you not like, and so on. And I'd encourage you to speak up and share those with the talking stick.
I don't like yellow.
You don't like yellow? Okay.
Well, one thing that I notice also is that if it's blue, everything is blue blue, you're going to have problems with people who are colorblind.
Okay.
I mean, color blindness I know is an issue, and I'm
Right.
made aware of that because I've done infographics and got feedback from a researcher with the water survey who was colorblind. Who
Okay.
had trouble distinguishing between different shades of blue.
Okay.
So, yeah.
That's a really good point. Yeah.
So anytime you're doing anything in color, you got to think about that.
Right. Right.
Which it just never crossed my mind before because it's not a problem for me.
Right, sure, right. Yeah, so these sort of accessibility types of issues are really important. There are a lot of, the WC3, so the World Wide Web Consortium, has a lot of principles for making web pages more accessible nowadays. And because I hadn't actually thought about this accessibility issue for posters before, but I would imagine that some of those would translate to poster design like this color issue. So that's a really important point to highlight.
From a non-colorblind person who can see normally, I would also contest that at least the light blue for the regular text where you're reading paragraphs and stuff just seems a little light to me. I prefer the contrast of black and white for text usually.
Right. Yeah, so there's kind of there could be this tension almost between wanting to be kind of creative and make it visually appealing on the one hand, but then if that comes at a cost of making your information just more cognitively challenging to, or visually challenging to read, then, you've kind of made things a little worse for yourself. I'm not sure if this is the issue you were mentioning yellow earlier, but for me anyway, it's sort of, I know it's a pie chart, but it's kind of there. It's not clear where the boundary is kind of one issue with that. So, so these are some things to think about here. And yeah, I don't know, having the kind of white background in a way also. On a poster, maybe it wouldn't be as bad, but we have we have the light blue and then the brightness of the white as well. So that, like you were saying, that contrast isn't really there. Let's pull up another one. Here. I just did one of these sessions last week, and these are all new ones here, so it looks like people are uploading them a lot. How can okay, view full screen. Okay. So many things. Okay. Would you like to choose one or two to get us started?
The first thing that jumps out at me is the dark background white text, but then the image behind it. It's just, there's a lot going on. That's what I would guess.
Right. So one thing with using this image as a background is, so the title's here, but it's kind of hard to just even read the title. So the scientific production of world researchers in viral hepatitis, a scientometric study. Then I guess, okay, so now so you kind of have to be able to read the title to have, I guess, and then make this guess that that's probably what the background image is. But the background image makes it hard to read the title in the first place. So you have this, not really a catch-22, but this kind of problem from the get-go there. I think there's also kind of, there's clearly a visual of some sort on here, but maybe it's not the appropriate sort because we have this background and then the rest of it is text. And so maybe this question of the balance between the text and the visuals is another one as well. But I shouldn't be giving my opinion on it. So
I think maybe what they were going for was putting like a crazy picture that would draw people in to figure out what that picture is. Maybe that was their point.
Yeah.
But then there's also like words on the picture itself, which are partially underneath the words of the text of the poster, which is confusing a little bit.
Oh, like so we have like,
I assume.
Yeah, liver down here.
And so I think they're trying to get people to be like, oh, what is that? And they go over and look at that.
Yeah.
And then since you can't read the title, you gotta spend more time.
So that's a strategy. I hadn't thought about. Yeah. No. No. Well, so I think there is maybe something to be learned from that, though. This it can be effective to put kind of I don't know, attention-grabbing image on there. So I don't know that, yeah, the problem I don't think is, and I don't know that I think anyone's suggesting this, but having the image of what I assume is hepatitis there, but the way in which it is displayed. And I think, honestly, a good practice would be to have some kind of caption for an image like this so that we're not guessing about what it is either. And then I don't know if, did you, yeah, go ahead.
I was just gonna point out that I had no idea that the title was in the gray part. I thought it was up in the blue part, and so I was trying to figure out what that was up there.
Yeah, I found that confusing as well, because what I was wondering is whether for this this conference, whether it was sort of this, everyone had this standard top to it, maybe. It's not clear, but in which case I think that would just make it more important to make your title kind of clear as well. Oh, uh-huh.
That's the template or if it's, that was a design choice.
Right. Yeah, I hadn't even noticed. So, yeah.
I was like, what's that box? Oh.
Yeah. Okay. Other comments on this one? Yeah, sure.
So I think they're sort of headers on the left-hand side, the background and objectives, the scientific methods, the findings. That all also sort of draws my eye that way instead of focusing it all on what the actual words are saying.
Uh-huh.
It'd be much better if it was bulleted for all of that.
Okay, right. So there was this, yeah, we have these kind of, these labeled sections, but the way in which they're labeled is sort of disjointed, sort of as well, yeah. Yeah, and I tend to agree as well about the, certainly having bullet points would be helpful here because, I mean, this is another thing to think about, I guess, you know, how people are going to be looking at your poster. If you have bullet points, I think it's easier to refer to them in the context of your presentation or even just while you're chatting with someone informally about your work. And just thinking from a sort of social standpoint, it would be awkward to say, okay, well, why don't you read this paragraph and I'm going to stand here next to you while you spend a couple of minutes reading. I mean, I would feel kind of awkward, you know, because you don't want, I mean, it depends on, you know, your personality, I suppose. But I think one thing that's so valuable about, you know, conferences and poster sessions is the interactivity. I mean, that's why you get together is to, you know, correspond and talk with other people. And so something like this could be kind of get in the way of some of that conversation that could be happening. Okay, let's maybe look at one more. Get so small here. Well, I'll just pick one at random anyway. View full screen. Whoops. Okay. Anything jump out at anyone about this one? So one thing that I could point out to start us off anyway is, so a couple things that I think this is doing pretty well. We have clearly labeled sections, and I think it's fine to kind of put the section label over like that. I think it's pretty clear. Another thing that I hadn't gotten mentioned yet was thinking about what order people are going to be naturally inclined to read the material on your poster. And here, I think it's pretty clear that you go background, methods, results, discussion, conclusion. You know, it's there. I think people generally, you know, will read left to right or kind of down like newspaper style. So if you violate either of those kind of standard ways people read things, then you know, people might have a tendency to read, and I've seen posters that do that, which is why I mention it. So that's one thing this poster does well. In terms of just space taken, I think the kind of balance of visuals and text is okay, but one thing that jumps out to me is that it feels like there's a lot of white space, which is kind of wasted space. This isn't to say that you need to fill everything up, but perhaps, you know, changing some of the text to bullet points that are a little bit bigger would take up some of that white space, but sort of be more effectively using it is one thought I might have on this. I also kind of don't like the result, because I think this is kind of, this graph here at the bottom left, or this chart is probably a pretty important, I would guess, but it almost looks like a footnote down there at the bottom. So even though they were trying to sort of keep with this organization, putting it under the results section, it might be worth thinking about. Your results might be kind of your most important thing, or one of your most important things, and you want to make sure that those are kind of given the spot they deserve, I guess. So those are some of my thoughts on this one. Anyway. Okay.
I was just gonna say,
Uh-huh.
they could have eliminated the methods section and blown up the results part, and then they'd have more room to look at that graph.
Uh-huh.
And so then, if someone asks about their methods, they know what they've done, so they can talk about it.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that's a nice suggestion there. It's kind of like this. Yeah, I mean, you got to think about what makes the cut, because you only do have so much space there. And yeah, I mean, in this case, looking at it, it sounds like they were using a kind of standard method here, even so it's not necessary maybe to highlight it. I mean, it's something that could go out of handout as well. Okay. Yeah, it kind of does. That's a good point. Yeah, it does kind of have that look to it. And I think part of it might be just the all white background just kind of makes it seem more like a handout. Yeah.
There's some kind of watermarked image behind it though, which I can see.
Oh, okay.
Which is really hard to see.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
I don't know, might make it a little bit more visually interesting.
Okay.
Actually looking at the poster.
Sure. Okay, yeah, that's good to know. Yeah. I never mean to be, disparaging the individuals who've created this work. Yeah, right. Yeah, right. Yeah, that's gonna happen someday. Yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah. Anyway, yeah. So, there's lots more examples on that website, and then so that was that F100 or 1000 there as well. And so I'd encourage you again, if you're looking for inspiration, just wanting to sort of critique more, to think about the different elements, to take a look at that as well. And then some other examples as well. I think this is the best one for just going to posters. This Flickr pool poster sessions, it's like things like this. So, which, I mean, you might enjoy. It's not as good. I mean, there's a few where you actually have the poster itself, but it's just pictures of actual poster sections, which can be interesting to look at for different purposes, I suppose. And then this blog here, Better Posters, a whole blog dedicated to this. So.
Is there an easy way to pull up posters in Ideals so people can?
Oh, that's a good question. Let me. That's a really good question. Right. Well, they're actually. I don't know that they do. Let me just try typing in poster here, because I know when you submit to Ideals. Okay, so if you just type in posters, you get a lot of stuff here. Let's see what the post. Is there actually? Maybe there's nothing in this one. So then, yeah, we have, so there's the ethnography of the university initiative, which is there. So there's classes in which the students do research about various elements of the university. And so they have a poster session every spring. So and then their posters go into Ideals. So there's those. Let's see. Yeah, here, it looks like a few different things. And there's actually, well, it's giving me 7,000 results here. I can't imagine those are all. But when you do upload to Ideals, one of the metadata fields is what kind of work is it, and poster is one of the options. So if the metadata is correct on those, let's just click at one. And although this one, okay, let's Let's see what this is. Okay, yeah, I mean, that looks kind of more like a flyer, but it might have gotten put as a poster on there because I don't know that there's a category for. Oh, I see. Yeah, right. Yeah, because I'm not sure if there's a way to do an advance. Yeah, so somebody interpreted the field kind of, I mean, I suppose that's a reasonable interpretation. But, okay, it looks like that just downloaded. Okay, so here's the other, this is an ethnography of the University Initiative one. Yeah, so you could go through and look at them as well on there and post them on there. Put your own in there if you're interested in doing that too. So, and then you get a per. I believe you could also just email ideals somewhere on here, and they'd be happy to help you with that. Yeah. Uh-huh.
Well, Susan Braxton is the
Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah. Perfect.
For those not at ISTC or the Geo Survey. Yeah. Or, I mean, I'm happy to facilitate also.
And then you get, I mean, you get permanent, URL, which is useful to put on your website or your CV or whatever as well. And it's just that way you don't have to worry about, maintain if you're changing websites or something, it will always be there, and you could always have that link to it. So you can put other research there as well, papers, that sort of thing. So anyway,
I encourage our staff to do that, but I'm the only one who does. So.
Yeah. Well, I will echo that sentiment. And also, I mean, stuff that goes in here is typically open access. If you have something that you need to sort of be restricted, you could do that as well. But that's another benefit, is it makes it more widely available to everyone. So, okay, any final questions? Well, if not, I thank you for having me here today, and please don't hesitate to follow up with me if any questions occur at a later point in time. So have a good afternoon.